Hi, it's Dwight again. Today I want to talk to you about the four Asian tigers. That moniker was assigned to them largely because their growth since World War II has been nothing short of miraculous. In fact, if you looked globally, with the possible exception of Israel, no other country has ever accomplished what these four countries did in a very short period of time. I'm going to talk to you about them individually and then move on to some larger comments about the four of them. I'm going to start with Hong Kong, or the Special Administrative Region of the People's Republic of China. Hong Kong, which means fragrant harbor, was first established as a British colony by the Treaty of Nanking after the First Opium War in 1842. At that point in time, the population of Hong Kong Island was about 7,450 people. It mostly consisted of Tonka fishermen and Hakka coal burners, scattered amongst a number of coastal hamlets. The establishment of a free port turned Hong Kong into a rather major entrepot, attracting new immigrants to settle from China and Europe alike. And it became a major trading spot for, very quickly after its founding. And it continued that way up until World War II. It was the Japanese occupied it during World War II, and then the British resumed control until 1997, in which case it was handed back to China. Hong Kong's population recovered quickly after the war, as a wave of skilled immigrants from China flooded into Hong Kong for refuge from the Chinese Civil War, which you recall went from 1945 to 1949. In the 1950s, Hong Kong's rapid industrialization was driven by textile imports, manufacturing industries, and the re-export of goods to China. Being that China was largely, closed off at the time, one of the few entrees was through Hong Kong. There were a series of reforms that were made, particularly amongst under Sir Murray McLeod's, 25th governor of Hong Kong from 1971 to 1982. Improved public services, environment, housing, welfare, education, infrastructure. But basically, the idea behind the success of Hong Kong is it's one of the few places, in fact, probably the only place on planet Earth that we actually attempted to do laissez-faire capitalism. And the strange part about this was that, as a British colony, at the same time the British government was strangling their own economy back home, they let the Hong Kong economy, flourish. Trade in Hong Kong accelerated even further when Shenzhen, a city to the immediate north, was designated a special economic zone by the Chinese government in 1980. You might recall that from previous lectures. And it successfully transitioned its economy to one involving the service sector, as evident by the high growth rates during the 80s and 90s. In 1984, there was negotiation between the British government and China. The Sino-British Joint Declaration, which transferred control on July 1st, 1997. The deal was that Hong Kong remain autonomous as a special administrative region and be able to retain its free market economy. It's also supposed to have, local elections, but those haven't quite worked out like they promised. But it's one of the world's leading financial centers. Up until the point in time when the British handed it back to Hong Kong, it was said that every dollar in the world in the course of a single year would pass through Hong Kong. According to the Index of Economic Freedom, Hong Kong has had the highest degree of freedom in the world since the inception of the index in 1995, so that really hasn't changed much. Entrepreneurs thrive in Hong Kong. By the late 20th century, Hong Kong was the 7th largest port in the world and second only to New York and Rotterdam in terms of container throughput. Our main trading partners are China, the United States, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, Singapore, and of course South Korea. And as I said, it's been an interesting experiment, and we're looking forward to see how it progresses from this point on. We'll talk more about that. Need to move on to one of the most powerful of the Asian tigers, the Republic of Singapore. Temasek, sea town in the Malay language, a 2nd century outpost of the Sumatran Srivijaya Empire, is the earliest known settlement in Singapore. But modern Singapore, as we know, was founded in 1819 by Sir Stamford Raffles as a trading post of the East India Company, with permission from the Sultan of Johor. The English name of Singapore is derived from the Malay word Singapura, or Lion City. Hence, if you've ever been to Singapore, the lion logo is everywhere. In 1824, the entire island became a British possession under a further treaty with the Sultan. Prior to Raffles' arrival, there was only about 1,000 people living on the island, mostly indigenous Malays with a handful of Chinese. By 1860, the population exceeded 80,000, and more than half were Chinese. Like most of the parts of this region, during World War II, the Japanese invaded British Malaya, culminating in the Battle of Singapore. The British surrendered on 15th of February 1942, and the Japanese occupied Singapore, and the British repossessed it in September 1945. At that point in time, there were folks that were actively advocating for Singaporean independence. But it wasn't until the 1959 election, the People's Action Party, the PAP, when in a landslide victory, Singapore became an internally self-governing state within the Commonwealth, and Lee Kuan Yew became the country's first prime minister. There was an attempted federation. Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman proposed the formation of a federation which would include Malaya, Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak in 1961. Lee began a campaign for the merger with Malaya and an end to British colonial control. On September 16th, 1963, Singapore became a part of Malaysia. However, the union was proved to be short-lived. The Singapore and Malaysian governments disagreed on many political and economics issues, leading to a discontent that culminated in 1964 race riots in Singapore. Unable to resolve the crisis, Tunku Abdul Rahman decided to expel Singapore from Malaysia. Lee reluctantly signed a separation agreement on 7th of August 1965. At that point in time, Singapore became an independent country. Singapore has always had a lack of natural resources. In fact, the water supply comes from Malaysia, and very limited defensive capability. And Lee and the Singaporean government had to face those squarely in 1965. Prior to 65, Singapore had a GDP per capita of $511. Then the third highest in East Asia. Think that one through. But it's got a highly developed market economy based historically on extended entrepot trade. In 1961, the Singapore government established the Economic Development Board, the EDB, to spearhead investment drive, make Singapore an attractive destination for foreign investment. And if you know anything about the history of this region, FDI inflows increased greatly. By 2001, foreign companies accounted for 75% of manufactured output and 85% of manufactured exports. If you've ever been to Singapore, if you drive down the streets there, every major tech company in the world has an office there. There are more than 7,000 multinationals from the US, Japan, and Europe that have a presence in Singapore. There's approximately 1,500 companies from China and a similar number from India. I mean, so if you're anybody, you're doing business in Singapore nowadays. The country is today the world's fourth largest financial center, the world's second largest casino gambling market, one of the world's top 3 oil refining centers, the world's largest oil rig producer, and a major hub for ship repair services on a tiny little island. The port is one of the 5 busiest in the world. Has the highest trade to GDP ratio in the world, 410% almost. The Singapore government, being that they own most of the land, has poured a lot of money into 2 sovereign wealth funds. One of them is called Temasek Holdings, of which you're aware, and the other one is GIC Private Limited. Those are used to manage the country's reserves. Very hands-off kind of approach. The Singapore government never talks to the holding companies about the businesses they're involved in. State ownership, however, is very prominent in strategic sectors of the economy, including telecommunications, media, public transport, defense, of course, airport operations, well as banking, shipping, airline infrastructure, and real estate. Lee Kuan Yew is one of the great men in Asian history. He passed away this year. And it is truly amazing what he has done, or what he was able to do with his country, and turn it into one of the richest spots on the planet in a very short period of time. Which, of course, leads us very naturally to the Republic of Korea. History goes back quite a bit farther. After the reunification of the three kingdoms of Korea in 668, Korea enjoyed over a millennium of relative tranquility. They were just too big, and too well armed to bother with. But they were occupied in 1905 by the Japanese during the Russo-Japanese War. In 1910, Tokyo formally annexed the entire peninsula. Korea regained its independence following Japan's surrender to the United States in 1945. After World War II, they had a democratic-based government was set up in the southern half of the Korean peninsula. Well, a communist-style government was installed in the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, under the Kim family. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, sparking the Korean War. The Cold War's first major conflict that continued until 1953. And by the way, in 1953, we did not sign a peace treaty. We signed an armistice, which is a ceasefire, which split the peninsula along a demilitarized zone at about the 38th parallel, which has a combination of the world's largest minefield and on the north side of the border, the world's largest artillery emplacements. Following the Korean War, however, South Korea remained one of the poorest countries in the world for over a decade. It was a larger agricultural society. In 1960, its gross domestic product per capita was $79. And in 1960, they had a student uprising. There were a lot of those happening in the 60s, but this was one of the first. The April 19th Revolution, as the Koreans term it, led to the resignation of the autocratic, corrupt President Syngman Rhee and brought about a period of political instability. Various parties were vying to find out who would control Korea. That was broken by Park Chung-hee. General Park Chung-hee led a military coup in 1961. By 63, Park was elected president in his own right as a candidate of the newly created Democratic Republican Party, and he ruled until his assassination in 1979. Park was heavily criticized, and I would argue rightly so, as a military dictator, who extended his rule by creating a new constitution which gave the president sweeping, almost dictatorial powers. The parliament pretty much did what the president wanted. However, the Korean economy developed significantly during Park's tenure. Government developed the nationwide expressway, the Seoul subway, and laid the foundation for government development during his 17-year tenure. The results were pretty remarkable. Between 1962 and 1994, the South Korean economy grew at an average rate 10% annually, fueled by an annual export growth of 20%, a period called the Miracle on the Han River, and rightly so. In 1979, there was another coup, in this case by General Chun Doo-won, and they overthrew the government of Park. And his government held Korea under rather despotic rule for another 8 years, when a Seoul National University student, Park Chung-chul, was tortured to death. And that led to another uprising, in this case led by the Catholic Priests Association for Justice. And they ignited this June democracy movement. Eventually, Chun's party, the Democratic Justice Party leader Roh Tae-woo, announced the 629 Declaration, which included the direct election of a president for the first time. Roh went on to win the election by a narrow margin against his two main opposition leaders, Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam, and led the country for quite some time. South Korea was one of the world's fastest-growing economies from the early 60s to the 1990s, still one of the fastest-growing development countries in the 2000s. The South Korean economy is heavily dependent on international trade, and in 2010 was the 6th largest exporter and 10th largest importer in the world. And it was one of the few developed countries that were able to avoid a recession during the recent GFC. The growth of the industrial sector was the principal stimulus to economic development. Like a lot of countries, they adopted an industry-first strategy under Park. And they adopted this outward-looking strategy in the 60s, deciding to become a major exporter. In the 80s, in order to control inflation, they adopted a very conservative monetary policy and tight fiscal measures. They weren't engaging in budget deficits, which small countries tend to do. To reduce the imbalance between rural and urban sectors, Seoul expanded investments in public projects such as roads, communication facilities, and further promoting farm mechanization. They've achieved a 9.2% real growth rate between 1982 and 87, 12.5% between 86 and 88. But after the 1997 Asian financial currency crisis, things went down a bit. So the yuan, the Korean currency, the yuan, depreciated heavily in 1997. But much of South Korea's recovery from the Asian currency crisis can be looked at as a result of labor adjustments and alternative funding sources. Korea's economy has moved away from a centrally planned government-directed investment model towards a more market-oriented one, and the growth rate, has still been more than spectacular. Growth fell by 3.4% in the fourth quarter of 2008. However, by 2010, they made a strong rebound with a growth rate of 6.1%, and it continues to this day. Oh, okay. The Republic of China, the island of Taiwan, formerly known as Formosa, which means beautiful in Portuguese, by the way, was mainly inhabited by Taiwanese Aborigines until the Dutch and Spanish settlement in the 17th century. The main purpose of the occupation of Taiwan by the Dutch East India Company was to trade with mainland China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. In 1895, military defeat forced China's Qing dynasty to cede Taiwan to Japan. For the most part, Taiwan's economy during the Japanese rule period was a colonial economy. They used it pretty much using a mercantilist structure. But it changed. Following the communist victory on the mainland in 1949, post-World War II, 2 million nationalists fled to Taiwan and established a government. After the Kuomintang retreat to Taiwan, Taiwanese society was relatively stable politically in the 1950s. Chiang Kai-shek became president of the Republic of China on March 1st, 1950. Was reelected by the National Assembly president again on May 1954, and again 1960, 1966, 1972. The KMT regime established several economic plans and policies. Of primary importance in the long-run growth of the economy was a commitment to education, a very highly educated population. Successful land reform also took place, and this was always one of the keys in agricultural economies. Because prior to independence, land was largely held by large landowners, which meant that the peasant farmers didn't get a look in. The government also proceeded with what's called an import substitution policy. What happens then is we take what was obtained by agriculture to give support to the industrial sector. That we grow local industrial companies by throwing up large tariff walls. Once they get strong enough, we take the tariffs off and let them compete. Unlike a lot of countries, the tariffs actually went off, and Taiwan pursued a policy of export expansion. Beginning in 1974, Premier Chiang Ching-kuo proposed the 10 major construction projects. There were 6 transportation projects, 3 industrial projects, and 1 power plant construction. These served as a basis for heavy industrial development in Taiwan. They had very technocratic policy when it came to economic development. But that was running under martial law until 1987. Real growth in GDP has averaged around 8%. Agriculture contributes about 3% to GDP, down from 35% in 1952, but now the service sector makes up 73% of the economy, which means it's fully completed the transformation from agriculture to industrial to post-industrial. Since the 1990s, the economy of Taiwan adopted an economic liberalization with successive regulatory reforms. It's a very free economy nowadays. Foreign trade has clearly been the engine of growth for Taiwan's rapid growth during the last 40 years. In 2013, the service sector accounted for a full 69% of Taiwan's GDP, while the industry and agricultural sectors accounted for 29% and 2% respectively. But the service sectors are plagued by a bit of low productivity. It's still relatively small on scale, domestically oriented, and that's something they're going to need to overcome. So, what kind of big picture can we draw here? Even while I'm going to be doing some of it, I would caution anyone against drawing parallels too closely because, we have 4 different countries, 4 different economic systems. There are some similarities, however. 3 of the 4 have large Chinese populations. And there's some research that shows that, particularly the coastal Chinese from Guangdong, Fujian, who left China and moved to places like Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, that they've been part of the engine for growth in those various economies. 3 of the 4 of these countries would be ruled by leaders who we would consider strongmen. They were autocrats in every sense of the word, democracy, not even with a small d. While the 4th was overseen by benign neglect by the British government. I said that benign neglect, I think, is one of the more amazing stories of the 4. That even when Britain was, with the Attlee government, post-World War II, was creating the world's first modern welfare state and increasingly controlling the commanding heights of the economy. It never happened in the colony of Hong Kong. 2 of the 4 had roots in British common law. An exam question I pop up occasionally is, what was Britain's greatest export? The Industrial Revolution or British common law? I have no good answer to that one, so don't look at me. All 4 of these, of course, being small countries with large coastlines, are heavily dependent on foreign trade, and that was part of their growth strategy. 2 of them started off as entrepot ports, and of course, the other 2, have very major ports in and among themselves. None of the 4 were true democracies. Today, Taiwan and South Korea clearly are. Singapore, nearly so. And China, no way in hell. Now there's some differences. While 3 of them were centrally planned, we had planning commissions, we had the commanding heights of the economy firmly occupied by the government pursuing a development strategy. Hong Kong truly epitomized laissez-faire capitalism. 2 of them had to be extensively rebuilt post-war. The other 2, not so much, but they were never that built up all the way along. 3 of the 4 were somewhat ethnically homogenous. So are there lessons that can be drawn? Like I said, I wouldn't. Some people try to. But I'd look at 4 countries who had truly remarkable development strategies post-World War II. All 4 of these places can be called miracle economies for very good reason. That it's a very unique piece of global history that these 4 places occurred, that they grew so rapidly, and that they went from small little spots, in the middle of nowhere, to being true 4 industrial and economic giants. So, I'm going to leave you there. Thanks so much again for listening, and have a good one. Bye-bye.